The only thing worse than not being able to make stuff in the shop is being at home all day and not being able to make stuff in the shop. Well, I couldn't stand it anymore, so even though I've only got one arm, I decided to make something. I'm going to try something I haven't done before, a box joint inlay. I'll use maple and walnut for the contrast, and I'll use my outstanding box joint jig that I highlighted in a previous video. My stock was already flattened and planed to the same thickness, so I'll just joint one side so I can cut it to width. The initial box joint size will be a 1/2 inch, so I can have an 1/8 inch reveal of walnut all around the joint once I cut the final 1/4 inch joint. So my final width will be 2.5 inches. Next, I'll square up one end of each piece so I can cut them to their final length. I'm making an 8x10 picture frame, so the length will be 8 inches plus twice the thickness of the stock, and 10 inches plus twice the thickness of the stock, plus a 1/4 inch for the 1/8 inch reveal on each end. I'm using a stop block clamped to the fence to prevent any kickback while I'm making the cuts. It's a good idea to always do this, but especially when you only have one arm. Now I'll get out the box joint jig and start making joints. First, I'll cut the 1/2 inch joints on the long pieces. I set the blade height to the thickness of the stock plus an 1/8 inch to allow for the 1/8 inch walnut reveal. I'll flip the piece over so that I always start the cuts from the same side. Next, I'll cut the corresponding fingers with the walnut. Once I've cut the walnut, I'll cut off the fingers with just a little extra so I'll have a good surface to sand after the glue up. Now I can glue the maple and walnut together, laying each flat on the table. And I'll apply some clamps to make sure it's nice and tight. After some sanding, I'll mark the walnut for the 1/8 inch reveal and cut the excess off using the miter gauge. Now I have to do some figuring. The new fingers have to be centered in the walnut fingers, but this is easy enough to do just by eyeballing it. Cutting the corresponding fingers in the maple is a little more difficult, but marking out the waist like you would for a dovetail keeps me from making mistakes, which means less headache. The glue up goes fairly easy and clamping keeps it tight. I use plenty of glue here just in case there are small gaps to hide. I'll check for squares so I can make adjustments as necessary. After the glue dries and I do an initial sanding to level the fingers, I'll give the outside edges a small round over. Because it is a picture frame, I glue in small strips of walnut that will hold either the glass and photo or the painting when it's inserted from the back of the frame. Now it's time for the final sanding. Once I get the walnut strips leveled, I'll sand with 120, 180, and finish with 220 grit. I like to lightly mark all the surfaces with pencil as I sand. If all of the marks are gone, I know I've sanded out the scratches from the previous grit. For the finish, I'm using Minwax satin polyurethane, sanding with 320 between each coat. As you saw in the video, I made two mistakes. The first mistake was that I should have inverted the fingers on each piece. That way I would have had 3 pins instead of 2, and it would have looked more interesting. The second mistake was adding an 1/8 inch to each of my initial fingers. This was simply a miscalculation on my part that resulted in the reveal of the walnut having a thicker dimension on the inside of the joint. But all in all, I think the project was a success. I learned a lot as I did it, and I'm no longer scared to attempt the inlay, which, as you can see, makes a simple box joint really nice. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please subscribe. If you didn't, subscribe anyway. I welcome any comments or suggestions you might have. Also, there's a link to the music you heard during the video below, and I'd love for you to give it a listen. Thanks for watching. And there you go.